Today we're looking at Abyss by Max Hastings. This is written in 2022 and it's about the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. I didn't actually pick this book myself. This was one that my daughter's school, you make donations and all sorts of old things you don't need. The kids then go in with money at Christmas and they buy things to bring home for their families. And she looked at this whopper and said, wow, that looks boring and big. My dad will love it. So brought it home for me. Charming, I think. I guess maybe slightly proud. Fortunately, she was right. I did like it. It's very interesting. But the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of those things that I knew so little about that I wouldn't even have bothered to pick up a book on it, I don't think, because I didn't even know how much I didn't know. But the account here is, despite being very long-winded for actually something that didn't take that long, it's very good. I mean, it covers off all the different angles and leaves you with a really good sense, I think, of how it all panned out, just without all the actual terror of the time that everyone seemed to be subjected to, that actually it was going to be the end of the world through a nuclear holocaust. The main sort of players, for want of a better word, were JFK, President of the US, Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba at the time, a somewhat dodgy guy, and Nikita Khrushchev, who was leader of the USSR at that point. I think if all you knew about this was that those three people were in charge and that there was a period of about 2 weeks when the whole world was on the brink of nuclear war, you'd probably assume, I think, that some massive thing had happened, some really big, significant event. But you read the book and you think, actually, when you boil it down, it all seemed to start largely because Khrushchev was a muppet. The whole idea, anyway, was that Khrushchev was in alliance with Castro, and just sort of a bit of anti-America, I suppose, being close to the American border, and seemed to think that he could get some nuclear missiles and sneak them into Cuba, and then when the Americans eventually noticed that they just wouldn't seem to mind and that he would get away with it. And it would seem to be obviously just a horrible, aggressive idea, and if it was ever going to get found out that he'd done it, then he was going to be in a lot of trouble. I suppose if he got caught early enough, it would have been fine, perhaps. But he got caught sufficiently late that he had already got a load of nuclear missiles into Cuba. All these things pointed at the US. The odd thing, I think, or one of the particularly odd things in this, is that it didn't seem to make much difference in that the Russians already had nuclear missiles that they could hit the US with. These ones were just a bit closer. So I suppose there's a reasonable argument that you get more warning if they're coming from further away, so the US would get less warning. So perhaps a bit more useful for first strike, and there's a chance you can hit everything before the Americans can respond. But it doesn't seem there's any sort of sense that these missiles are being put there to actually be used. It does seem like there's just that escalation of deterrence. But the politics particularly of that time were such that there was no way Kennedy could possibly let him get away with it. But as soon as he called Khrushchev out on this, Khrushchev's in the position that he couldn't possibly back down and admit he'd been a bit of a spanner trying to sneak nuclear weapons just south of America. It doesn't sound like it helped that it seems like Kennedy was getting some really dodgy advice from some... It's difficult to know what people's incentives might have been. I mean, this is a long old time ago, obviously. But it does seem some of the advice to Kennedy was really aggressive in the sense of stuff that would seem pretty obvious, would have escalated things and caused all sorts of problems. It did seem it became almost like some sort of pissing contest, for want of a better word. Albeit it is generally considered, I believe, to be one of JFK's finest hours. I think actually to some extent, more credit to him, not only that he de-escalated, but actually that it must have been really difficult when you're getting a lot of pressure from your advisors to do aggressive things. And Kennedy's to some extent resisting this. And of course he has to be firmer. So I'm very glad that wasn't my job, that's for sure. That's who would want to be president or prime minister or whatever. But it's, yeah, either way, generally considered Kennedy's finest hour. From the UK perspective, I've only ever heard about this from people here. So a lot of worry in the UK, despite the UK not actually having an active role in it. But it does seem that people in the UK were more concerned about the Americans escalating things than they were about Khrushchev just randomly, oh, I'm going to drop some bombs. So it was interesting, isn't it, that the Russians have done this massive offensive thing, but people are actually more worried about America reacting and triggering some sort of escalation and war than they were about the Russians using the missiles they put there in the first place. It all eventually ended anyway when Kennedy made some concessions in the sense that America had some nuclear missiles in Turkey and agreed to remove those, and then Khrushchev was, I guess that gives Khrushchev some sort of win that he can then withdraw at home as well. So it then sort of just de-escalated quite gently. It's interesting, isn't it? Because nothing materially happened in the sense that Khrushchev just made a really silly idea that wasn't going to make a great deal of difference anyway. They have a little bit of politics for 2 weeks while everyone gets a little bit aggressive. And then things go back to roughly how they were, except the nuclear missiles of Americans in Turkey were also removed. It's a terrifying thing, isn't it? I mean, it sort of alludes to that problem that nuclear, that's a hard word, isn't it? Nuclear technology is not the problem in itself. The problem is the people who are in charge of flinging these things at each other. And whilst it does seem very much that Castro was egging on for a nuclear war and did seem to actually want one, because obviously he was completely barking mad, it seems pretty clear that Khrushchev and JFK obviously didn't want one, and Khrushchev, it seemed, very much did not want one either. So that's just, I guess it doesn't really matter it doesn't matter if you want the war or not. If someone's a big enough muppet, then there's a chance you can have one. And I guess in that respect, it's really important that this sort of thing is remembered. If you fancy having remember it, definitely well worth a read. My daughter was right in the sense that it is very long, but wrong in the sense it's not boring. So, well worth it.